cover page, let me say, and I'm saying 75 because I'd written a couple of notes there I wanted you to see and just say some things about it. Hey, folks, those of you who are watching by YouTube today, let me tell you we're going to be in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 10. Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 10. And our subject matter for today is confidence in the face of fear. Confidence in the face of fear. So as you come in and as we get settled for a moment, we're going to be looking at that subject matter, okay? Confidence in the face of fear. I put in my notes as I'd read this earlier, but I come back and was writing this morning as I was refreshing myself. There's a couple of cases in the Old Testament I want to just sort of remind you of places where people should have feared. Now, you remember the story there, no doubt, of David and Goliath. Everybody in Israel on this side of the battle or the valley, all of them feared. Have you remembered that? Nobody would face Goliath. But then David comes up, and of all people, younger than any of the rest, possibly, let me say, smaller than any of the rest, he was willing to take on Goliath. Now, why was he willing? Do you remember what he said? The Lord was with him, and he stated it in a little different way. He said, the battle is the Lord's. In other words, it's not going to be something I do. It's going to be God working through me. But I also thought about Daniel. You remember when they were trying to find something against him that they could bring him to the judgment seat, okay? And you remember when you look at that what happened is that Daniel should have feared, but he didn't. Remember, Daniel continued to go to the window and pray like he always was. Why? Because, again, Daniel knew the ability of the Lord. And because of that, Daniel might not say it like David did, but he knew that his confidence was going to be in the Lord. And as a result of that, he stood faithful, okay? Now, on page 76, we got a little introduction. And the writer, as he gives us some thoughts on this, there's some little bullets, I call them, just some identifying marks there. And it talks about, when it talks about fear, he said, whether we want to admit it or not, fear is something we all wrestle with. Now, prayerfully, you don't wrestle with it to the same degree that you used to. And I'm using myself as an example there. Some things that I used to fear greatly. Thank the Lord there's been deliverance in a lot of those areas. Now, he just listed some of these things. The fear of standing on a high ladder. The fear of a spider crawling on your skin. The fear of standing on a stage with the spotlight beaming on you. The fear of getting sick. The fear of losing a job. The fear of something happening to one of your children or grandchildren, the fear of being alone, the fear of death and not being completely certain what would happen after you die. Now, how many of you might have had at least one of those fears at some time or another? Most likely all of us, would we not? Now, fear is not an uncommon thing in our lives, is it? I would think that many of the things we used to fear, we've been overcomers in those areas. However, there are some new areas being created every day in our lives. And one of our ways of not handling our fears is just not thinking about it. If we're fearful of what might happen if our spouse dies, you and I were talking this morning. If we dwell on that, we stay afraid. But hey, one of the methods of overcoming our fears that we try is just not thinking on it. But that just suppresses it. But bringing it before the Lord helps us to be overcomers. So today, we're looking at Abraham. Okay? And Abraham, we would like to think, had it all together. of all the people. Now, he picked up his family, moved halfway across the continent, but yet and still now comes a famine, and Abraham's a totally different person. Now, read it with me as you follow along. It said there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was severe. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, "Look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is your wife.' They will kill me, but let you live. Please say you're my sister, so it will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account." You remember the story quite probably. Those of you who have been teachers in your past, you've taught it. If not, we have heard it taught, we have heard it preached on, and we probably have formed our conclusion about what we would do in a similar situation. Now let me say, until we're there, we never really know what we would do. So, with that in mind, the first part of the verse number 10, there was a famine in the land. I put above that a cause. Now that's what has caused all of this other stuff to transpire. That famine brought this to light. So Abram went down to Egypt. That's the action. So we've got a cause and we've got an action. Now, if we would apply this similarly to our lives, there's possibly been a fear somewhere that was caused by something. It could have been a fear of speaking in public. Why? Because someone, when we were in second grade, might have made fun of how we talked. So from then on, when called upon or asked to read or pray, we would be frozen in fear, and we would refuse to do that. Why? Because of a cause way back here. Now, spiritually speaking, as we try to make application as well as interpretation on that here, it is a great famine. According to what the Scripture tells us, it has lasted for some time. It says it's very severe. Now, because of that, fear kicks in before he ever leaves for Egypt. In reality, what is he afraid of that makes him go to Egypt? Famine. He's afraid he can't feed his family. He's a very prosperous fellow. No telling how many herd or how large his herd was. So now he's got to say, well, now I'm not half as worried about my herd as I am the heads of my family. So because of that, he heads to Egypt. He's not the first to do this. He won't be the last. You remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how often that statement is made. And then when we look into those lives, there's going to be other famines, and sometimes there's going to be a like circumstance from their lives as well. The writer calls it his survival instinct. And that survival instinct led to that fear, and since God had called him to Canaan, surely God would take care of him in Canaan, as we think. But Abram approached Egypt, and his mind began to zero in on his fear, the writer called it. Now, what he becomes afraid of, secondly, is what? His wife. His wife, you say, or life? Life, yeah. He is afraid that, first of all, I think I could lose my wife because she's beautiful. Then secondly, I could lose my life because one of the ways they could get her is to eliminate me. Well, there's a lot of thinking into this process. But yet as he approaches Egypt, they were coming in as foreigners. In other words, they were not of the same blood and the same likeness there. But yet and still, as they come in, they have concocted the story about how we're going to survive where we are. Now, Sarah, he said, I know you're a beautiful woman. I know what kind of beautiful woman you are. Now, sometimes you try to imagine. You ever try to imagine what he's describing there? I don't know what he would be describing. Is he talking about facial features alone? I think he probably is. But yet and still, he said, that's going to create us a large problem coming to Egypt. Why? Because the fellas are going to assume that you're my wife, but you're supposed to tell them you're my sister. Now, the writer said it should not surprise us, since fear has the ability to reduce our sound judgment and logical reasoning, because fear is relentless in its power over us, and it can cause us to act erratically. Abram's fear inducing him to hand over his beautiful wife Sarah to the Egyptian Pharaoh so that his own life would be saved. And the writer helps us know it's in the line of cultural thinking at this time. That's just the way they acted. That's just the way the world was in those particular, in that particular season. Now, he asked a question there on that page. He said, what are some situations that can cause us fear instead of trusting God? What are some situations that can cause us fear instead of trusting God? How many of you had an MRI lately? And you were told, now, hey, the radiologist says you need to look for this because I see something there and not sure what that is, so we better do a CT scan on top of what we've already done. You know, what happens to your mind in a time like that? Fearful. What's that? Fearful. Fearful. Now, you say, why are you illustrating like that? Because I am the man. You know, little back trouble, get an MRI, go see the back doctor. He said, hey, the radiologist said, you need to see a urologist. I said, well, I've already saw one. He said, well, you need to see him again. Because, and well, you go get a CT scan, and the lady says, now, we'll get this report back today, but you know it's Friday, so they're not going to be in the office, so it'll be next week sometime. Now, what are you thinking about through all that? Fishing? Nah. In ways, if you don't dwell on it, you don't worry about it. Why? Because there's nothing there. Well, don't think that fear all comes from medical instances. What are some other fears? Is my money going to run out before my time? You know, we men, we might think like that. Now, you fellows that have, or you people that have retirement accounts from your former employment, you know, that stuff is supposed to be there as long as you live, isn't it? You know? But who can attest to that, I call it? Yeah. There is a lot of things that cause us fear if we allow it to. But if we don't allow it to, we can live with peace in those situations. Now, on page 78, it said there is a better way to handle fear. Peter and the other disciples were in the boat when a storm came up, began to plummet the boat in the waves. To their amazement, Jesus came to them walking on the water. Peter had the courage to ask Jesus to command him to come to him. And what happened to Peter? He was able to walk to Jesus on the water. People said, you know what? But he began to sink. He took his eyes off Jesus. What a lesson. Lest we become too critical of Peter, many of us never get out of the boat. See, those other 11, they really didn't have anything to say, could they? Because only Peter had attempted what he had asked Jesus to allow him to do. Peter began to look around at the surroundings. How many times do we do the same? Looking around at what's around us. Maybe it's like the young lady or young man who has studied the part for the cantata or the Christmas musical, and they've never performed it on a stage in front of people, but they've rehearsed it. And boy, they nailed it every time. Until they came in for the night of the production, and they saw 400 people sitting in front of them, and they froze. You know, sometimes you don't ever get over that stuff. You begin to allow that fear to multiply in other ways. So we know that fear is a real problem in our lives. I've mentioned a book that we read, and one of the subject matters in that book was fear itself. You know, what do you fear? Well, I fear itself. So with that in mind, we know that Abram had great fear. Now, the writer said, when we change our worry to worship and carry our fear to the Father, our perspective becomes clearer, and we'll avoid an unnecessary journey to Egypt. Now, Genesis 12 and 17, if you're following on not Facebook, YouTube, we're chapter 12, verse 17 of Genesis. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarah. So Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so I took her as my wife? Now, here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. If we read that verse 17 and on, what we discover is now Pharaoh is saying, what you were so afraid of has really got you deeper in trouble than what I would have done. In other words, if you'd have told me she's your wife, we wouldn't have messed with her. Well, now, again, words are cheap sometimes. We can't really say what would have happened there with Pharaoh, but this is how it is written. When Abram arrived in Egypt, the beauty of the wife Sarah captured the attention of the palace officials. Pharaoh had Sarah brought to him in exchange for Sarah. Pharaoh lavished Abram with many valuable gifts. He's blessing the man that brought the lady to the country. Well, what happens when we compromise? Well, we know that spiritually speaking, we lose our fellowship. But physically speaking, sometimes compromise is an easier way to get possessions, is it not? You know, when we think of fear, that happens in lots of cases. Pharaoh now is the object here of these few verses, because he has to clear things up, because his country now, or his household, has been hit with severe plagues. They've all come down with COVID. No, not really. They've come down with something because of what his family has been, well, not family, but because of what he's been guilty of. And now the Lord judges that family with some plague there. The writer said the text regarding any response from Sarah, any of her feelings, we don't have any record of that. However, she, like the writer said, must have felt betrayed by her husband. Confusion, hurt, and fear were probably not far off. She likely questioned any confidence she had in God's promise to Abram. Says fear can not only reduce our faith, but it can affect the faith of those around us. Fear, notice again, let me read that again. Fear not only can reduce our faith, but it can also affect the faith of those around us. Now, we as parents or grandparents now, as we've got a few years behind us, what we see there is that the eyes of those around us sometimes is looking to see how we're going to manage certain situations, is it not? And this is what we find in this passage. Concealing the truth with a lie keeps us from healing and moving forward. The fear of getting caught or the fear of telling the full truth or story only shows the lack of confidence we have in God to go before us. Now, with all of this in mind, it's like Pharaoh is now saying, how much is it going to take to get you out? How can we get rid of y'all? Y'all have caused us some trouble. Well, it says now they'll again, in turn, strike a reconciliation there, and we find that the famine of the cause of all of this, there's still famine, undoubtedly, but yet we've got to resolve the conflict here between Pharaoh and Abram, or the families there. Fears can lead to lies, and lies lead to hurting ourselves and others around us. Fear induced a lie, impacted Pharaoh and his household. The writer said how humbling that must have been for Abram to get a moral lesson from a pagan Pharaoh. That's pretty true there as you think about it, isn't it? In other words, here's a pagan Pharaoh, and here's Abram who has the promise of God. And we would think that Abram's more of a man of morals than a pagan Pharaoh, but yet and still the lesson comes from the reverse opportunity. The opportunity Abram had to exchange or exercise any leadership was being dismantled by his fear and lack of faith. The level of our fear and faith today can have a ripple effect on others for good or for bad. Our life is like an open letter, isn't it? Paul would use that in the Corinthian letter. He would say, you're a letter or an epistle, known and read of all men. You say, well, I don't like people looking at me and thinking about what I'm going to do. Well, it's not a matter of whether we like it or not. People's just, they just look and they make their evaluations of our lives. Now, I'm not asking you, or I'm not telling you, did Abram fail the test or did he pass the test? We do know, though, it was definitely a test, was it? And as he concocted that, he and Sarah together, we see that it cost in many ways. Now in Genesis chapter 13, on page 80, if you have your book, 13, Genesis 13, verse 1, it said, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, or the desert, he, his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him. That almost sounds like a similar verse that we read in chapter 12, doesn't it? With the exception of the definite place, but again, he, his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. He went by stages from Negev to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had formerly been, to the site where he had built the altar, and Abram called on the name of the Lord there. Now you remember, what was it in chapter 12? It said that he built an altar there, I think we remember. Well, very similar, isn't it? Someone has probably given you the counsel that I've been given before as well. They say when you lose something, go back to the very place that you knew you had it last. Now, that's not always good when you lose your tools to do that. But again, spiritually speaking, that's really what we're seeing. There's an application there, is there not? If we begin to see our fellowship with the Lord has been hindered, what we need to do is take a careful examination of possibly where we were when we had our last important, richest encounter with the Master that we know. Now, Pharaoh gave the orders to leave Egypt. Abram, Sarah, it says they line them up and they carry them back. They all go back. Now, notice verse 3. He went by stages. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. When I was preparing for this earlier in the week, I just sort of undoubtedly flew right over verse 3 because it seems to be not a real important verse. But now I personally have underestimated the size of this man's family, his possessions. You know, that group of people might have lasted for a mile or more. Now, when you're caravanning through the wilderness, the desert, when it says there that he sends them out in stages, there's definitely significance there. You remember later in the Bible, there's going to be a reconciliation taking place when Jacob comes back from Laban. Jacob went over there, an empty man comes back with 2 wives, 2 concubines, a lot of possessions. You remember what he did when he knows that, hey, I'm getting close there, and he said, I'm going to be meeting my old brother here pretty soon. And he said, now let's divide up into some groups here, some stages. Well, when I think of this, that's what I'm thinking of. These guys were partially experienced in caravanning, maybe. Well, it says, when we think of our seasons of defeat, he said, I imagine he may have felt insecurity and guilt over his failure. This doesn't give us a lot about how Abram is moved by his own action, does it? It doesn't say he regrets it. It doesn't say he's remorseful. It doesn't say he repented of it. He really is given no option by Pharaoh except, hey man, there's the way out. And we find that he moves. Now, on page 81, the writer's notes again, they're important to me there. Because he said Abram seemed to forget God's promise when he felt threatened. We quickly doubt God's promises, calling on our lives in fearful circumstances. When we come face to face with our failures, we often think God no longer can use us. Aren't you glad God gives second chances, third chances sometimes? Well, Abram, if God had been a God who was not merciful, what we would find is that not only would have Abraham missed the blessing, the world would have as well, because Isaac isn't born yet, is he? And the promise is going to come through that person. Now, Abram went back to where he first built the altar, which we referred to. He thinks about the promise. We know he's got to live with this promise. Your seed is going to be innumerable, more than the sand of the seashore. And he's not seeing that fulfilled quickly. Well, now again he goes back to that place, Bethel. And friend, how many times have we personally maybe missed something, or maybe we've miscalculated ourselves, but we know where to go back, and that is we go back to where we last were when we begin to sense the Spirit of the Lord nudging us and calling us back to Him. Now again, a significant place. You'll find it all through Scripture, Bethel. The important thing is that he understood who he was and who God is. Abram's act of worship reflects his recognition of the incredible mercy God granted to him instead of the incredible judgment he could have granted. Now, I love Lamentations 3:20 through 23 in times like this. When it talks about the Lord's mercies, he says they're new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. While we recognize that fear reduces our faith and confidence, one form of fear actually can strengthen our faith. What are we told about fear in the Bible? What are we told? You know, without miscalculating, it talks about fearing the Lord, doesn't it? That's not being afraid of the Lord like this, but it's living with a constant recognition that God is supreme. We're accountable to Him. So this fear that we see of confrontation, now Abram's going to make things right with the Lord, and the promise was not a conditional promise, if I remember it right. When he said, your seed, when he promised a son to them, it wasn't conditional upon the fact that Abram would have to be perfect. Aren't you glad the promises aren't that we all have to be perfect? However, he was faithful. As we understand the depths of God's power and holiness, the more confident we become, and we are overwhelmed by the heights of His undeserving mercy that He offers to us all. Let me ask this question on the bottom of the page, okay? What are some ways our group can help us overcome some of our fears and failures? Hey, listen, in a group this small even, what we recognize is that somebody might be thinking today, well, hey, God, you know what, I'm afraid. I did this or I did that. So what I put in my notes there is we need to remember others through their faith, but also through their failures. John Maxwell, a guy that I used to read behind, I haven't read lately, but John Maxwell was a fellow who talked about your failures don't have to be final. I like that. Why? Because simply, you know, there are places in our lives that we may miss the mark. Now, we may not be like David when he blatantly, you know, had Bathsheba brought to him, or we might not be like some of the other persons. But the reality is still this: God is willing to forgive of our sin, according to 1 John 1:9, if we confess to Him. And Abram, the man of faith that he was, God greatly uses after this issue here with Pharaoh in Egypt. Now, next week we'll be studying confidence in the midst of conflict. Those of you who might be listening by YouTube, look in Genesis chapter 13, verse 5. Genesis chapter 13, beginning in verse 5. Or let me just say the entire chapter there. And that's where we'll be studying from next week, okay? Thank you. Get you some water. God bless. And we'll see you again in the second service if you haven't been here earlier, okay?